Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be redesigning Dr. Mundo from League of Legends. I started off by drawing lots of different forms, muscular forms, to try and get into the feel of this character. Then I go around and very sketchily I sort of draw in a much more a much more solid pose with much more solid equipment and things like that. Then I go into a much more detailed form of sketching and I start with the head. I originally do quite a small head, but then realised Dr. Mundo has a much more boxy head, much more Frankenstein-esque head, and without that he sort of loses some of the Mundo go where he pleases. Then I go on to lots of the equipment, doing bands, leather straps to hold in his cleaver, the doctor's coat, and for this I decided to add ropes on the front because obviously he's so massive and so hulking. The coat wouldn't fit over his body, so I imagined he'd fasten this rope to it to keep it over him. Then I move on to the sketching, the line art phase of what I'm eventually going to draw, color over. During this I was just trying to add texture and trying to play with line weight variation for his body and the clothes, making the things like the leather bands have much thicker lines to try and contrast to, for example, the coat that has much thinner lines. I'm trying to work on this much more in the future, trying to get much more line weight variation, which is just the thickness of the line. I continue going over all the clothes, like the shorts and the belt he wears around the middle, imagining that he sort of raided a Zornite doctor's surgery or something like that, and tried to find as much equipment as he could. Then I go into colouring. For this character I was just using a base tone to flatly mark out the colour, and then going in with a darker hue of that and a lighter hue. I then blend these together, making sure that I'm doing multiple layers to build up this contrast. For the chest area I go in and do the entire chest, and then I will eventually delete the ropes. Instead of going around the ropes and doing it in sections, I did it all in one and then deleted the ropes. For his left arm, or the right arm as we're looking at it, I decided to add a much brighter highlight because that's the closest to the light source that I've imagined. I continue doing the arms and sections of the skin of the upper body, and then I will move on to the chest and the face and things like that. For the face I decided to have him with two different colour eyes. I can't remember what the condition is called, but I felt that this would just add the sort of craziness about the character, especially when coupled with his hulking figure and his purple skin. I'm going in and touching up some of the shadows under the ropes and making the shadows around his head much more visible. I'm not blending these shadows out because they're meant to be much harsher shadows, and they're meant to cause much more contrast than the soft shadows that I blend out. This just added some edge and some realism-ish to the character, where a blended shadow wouldn't add this. It also added variation in the shadows so that it's not all just one type of shadow. Going into the clothes, I was kind of experimenting with how to do this. So I'm doing weird shadows, spiked sort of ragged shadows to match the ragged clothes themselves. And then when I'm doing the bandages, I see this very mottled brush, so I decided to use that on the bandages and then add some sort of stains or marks on his other clothes with that. Then I'm going in and making small adjustments to the things around his belt and then finishing off the cleaver. For the leather I just did a black base coat, and then For the cleaver itself, I actually coloured it in a sort of brownish, very brown grey. Moving on to the second character, I decided that the first character was very, very sort of the same as Mundo now, so I decided to go into a more hulking, brutish route, deciding that he was much more dumb, much more brutish, and much more like evil, not necessarily evil, but much less human. To do this, I just made him hulking over in a more gorilla-like position, using his arms for stability and having his legs much smaller in proportion. Then going into his face, I gave him much less teeth, much more ragged positions, and I make his nose upturned so that his face, through that tilt, makes it look like it's almost tilting up, which makes him look like he has a very bad posture and his head is in the middle, tilted up slightly more. This just added to the bestial elements, making him look taller than you. I then move on to some of the clothing. I imagined this doctor's cloak on his shoulder, like there was no way he was even going to fit it over his shoulders, so he just tied it to his arm to add some sort of clothes, and also just some visual interest to the design. Because this design, because he was much more hulkish and brutish, he was going to have much less actually covering most of his body. It was mostly going to be muscles. So with that in mind, I went in and basically did a mask around the entire body and just coloured in his body as if he had nothing on, if it was just his chest. And then I go in and take out all of the things like the hair, the eyes, and the mouth, and also the cloak. I'm making sure that I'm trying to get very accurate into what it would, all the edges very, very accurate so that I don't bleed over the edges or anything. For this cloak, I decided that it would be easier just to go around the edge instead of going all the way around and then just delete from the outside. So that's what I did. Again, using that mottled brush to add some texture and variation from the smooth skin to this sort of stained textured clothes. Then I'm moving on to some of the other equipment, like this stereoscope, I think it's called. I'm not entirely sure. The thing that doctors listen to your heart, for example, with. And then I'm going over this sort of rack of vials on his shoulder, imagining that he just stole this from some sort of Zornite experimenter, something like Singed, but probably not as evil or cruel. I fill them all with this sort of blue bubbling liquid, changing up it slightly to make, from the different colours, to make a little bit of variation, but make sure they look like they're all the same potion or serum or something like that. Then moving on to the lower half of the body, this is quite simple. Most of the textures are just a blended out texture. If I did this character again, I would definitely make sure to add more variation to this skin, especially adding some veins or something like that. Again, I'm using the mottled brush to texture the shorts, and then I'm just going in and finishing up the legs. The legs are meant to look comically small to contrast to the upper body and the hulking nature of this beast, similar to how gorillas are. If you look at gorillas, they have huge upper bodies and quite small little legs. If you enjoyed my version of Dr. Mundo and what I think he could look something like when he is redesigned by League of Legends and the Riot team. If you did, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on any other uploads. And without further ado, I hope you have a great day. I'll see you in the next video.